my daughter spat in my face. Look at the great architect now pissing himself and reading sticky notes just to find the bathroom door. Your brain is a junkyard, Edward, and you're just a pathetic, useless old man. My stepwife just stood there with that fake saintly smile while she secretly soaked the floor in neurotoxins to rot my mind. They thought Alzheimer's had turned me into their personal ATM, a wallet with a pulse, to be bled dry. But they forgot whose house they're in. The toxic floor they built isn't my grave, it's their cage. I designed every inch of this lethal maze, from the shadows I am watching. And the reckoning has already begun. I'm grateful you're here. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. A note: this story includes fictional elements woven in for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but everything it has to say to you is worth hearing. I designed 47 buildings in my life. Hospitals, courthouses, private estates carved into the shoulders of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But the only building that ever truly understood me was the one I built for Catherine, and the one I secretly rebuilt in silence as the last design I would ever make. The hallway stretched ahead of me in the dark. I didn't remember walking out of the bedroom. That was the thing about this disease: it didn't announce itself with trumpets or warnings. It simply rearranged the furniture of your mind while you slept, so that when you woke, nothing sat quite where you had left it. I was standing in the main corridor of the Hollows at 3 a.m, barefoot on the hardwood floor, wearing the same gray pajamas I had put on 6 hours ago. The fog outside pressed against the tall windows like something alive, and the oak trees along the front drive had gone deep red and amber with October, the kind of color that looked beautiful only because it meant everything was dying. I knew where I was. That much was still intact. The Hollows, Asheville, North Carolina. My home for the last 11 years, built on land that had once served as an auxiliary relay station for the Army ground forces during the Second World War. I had purchased the property in 2013, 2 years after Catherine and I drove up the mountain road on a Saturday afternoon, and she said, without any drama whatsoever, "This is where we should grow old." She had a way of saying things like that, absolute and quiet, at the same time, the way a load-bearing wall holds a structure, without ever asking for recognition. She was gone now, had been gone since 2021. I turned my attention to the walls. They were covered in yellow sticky notes, dozens of them arranged in careful rows from shoulder height down to waist level, where my hand could reach without stretching. Names, dates, room designations: Vivienne wife's second floor, east bedroom. Dr. Martinez, neurologist, Mission Hospital. The kitchen is through the arch second left. My own handwriting. But reading it felt like reading a stranger's grocery list. I stood there in the dark and went through them one by one, the way a student reviews index cards before an exam. The difference being that most students expect to remember the material eventually. I had stopped expecting that, sometime around March. Edward's sweetheart. Her voice came from the far end of the corridor, soft and practiced, carrying just enough warmth to sound genuine. Vivienne appeared from the shadows near the east wing staircase, white silk robe, hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, not a single crease on her face despite the hour. She looked the way people look in pharmaceutical commercials about sleep medication, effortlessly composed, almost clinically so. That was the thing about Vivienne. There was never anything visibly wrong, and that I had come to understand was precisely what was wrong. "Come back to bed," she said, taking my arm with both hands. Her fingers finding my elbow with the practiced ease of someone who had guided unsteady patients through hospital corridors for 20 years. Former psychiatric nurse, that was how she had described herself when we met at a fundraiser at the Biltmore in February of 2023, 4 months after I received my diagnosis. 2 months after I began quietly redesigning the interior systems of this house, and approximately 6 weeks after I had started to suspect that my grief and my deteriorating memory had made me visible in ways I could not afford. I let her lead me back to the bedroom. I let her pull the blanket over my shoulders and smooth it at the edges the way you would for a child. I let her say, "You're all right, you just need rest," in that low, reassuring tone that she had perfected over years of managing people who could no longer fully manage themselves. And then she turned off the lamp and left, pulling the door to within an inch of closed, not fully shut, I noticed. She never fully closed the door. I lay still for a long moment. Then I opened my eyes. The ceiling of this room was 14 feet high, coffered mahogany, original to the 1940s framework that I had preserved when I redesigned the structure in 2013. I knew every dimension of it. I knew the load distribution of every beam overhead, the placement of every junction in the wiring behind the plaster, the precise location of the narrow cavity between the east wall and the outer facing, but that was not something I was ready to explain yet. What I was ready to explain was this. My name is Edward Calloway. I am 60 years old. I was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease on September 14th, 2022, by Dr. Renata Cruz at Mission Hospital in Asheville. I walked out of that appointment, drove to the overlook on the Blue Ridge Parkway where Catherine and I used to watch thunderstorms come in from the valley, and I sat in my car for 2 hours making a list of everything I would need to do before I forgot how to do it. The list was long. The most important item on it was not calling my attorney or updating my will or arranging medical proxies. The most important item was the one I had written at the top. Underline twice, rebuild the hollows. Do it now while you still can. I married Vivian Calloway on a Sunday in June of 2023, not because I loved her. I had known within the first week that she had not come into my life out of affection. The interest was too well timed, the attention too calibrated, the tenderness deployed with the precision of someone who had studied the target before making contact. I married her because I needed her inside this house. I needed her to believe she was winning, because the only way to catch someone who is hunting you is to let them think they are the hunter. The house was quiet now, or rather it was performing quiet. I had built it to do both, and I was the only one who knew the difference. I closed my eyes. Outside, the October fog thickened against the glass, and somewhere deep below the floorboards, in a part of the hollows that did not appear on any public record or architectural filing, something shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of sound a house makes when it is remembering something. The hollows had never truly been silent. I built it that way, every wall, every corridor, every shadow, carrying a purpose I had not yet finished explaining. What I had not anticipated was how many additional purposes it would come to serve. By 7 o'clock, the hollows had dressed itself for the day. Warm light pressed through the kitchen windows and long amber panels, catching the steam rising from the coffee pot, gilding the edge of the fruit bowl, turning the whole room into something that belonged in an architectural magazine spread titled Graceful Living in the Carolina Mountains. Vivian stood at the stove in her silk robe, humming something I didn't recognize, a melody without edges, the kind designed to fill a room without demanding attention. The eggs were done exactly the way I took them. The newspaper sat folded at a precise 45-degree angle beside my plate. The coffee was poured at the temperature I preferred, which I had mentioned exactly once 14 months ago in passing. I had learned over 18 months of marriage that when everything is exactly right, something is exactly wrong. I sat down and picked up the paper. The kitchen of the Hollows was my favorite room in the house, not because of any architectural distinction, though I had spent considerable effort on the proportions and the natural light, but because Catherine had chosen the tile herself. Deep slate blue laid in a herringbone pattern she had sketched on a paper napkin over dinner one night in 2014. She had been like that, decisive about the things that mattered and entirely unbothered about the rest. The kitchen still held her in its bones. I suspected that was part of why Vivian had made it her territory so completely and so quickly after moving in. Some people redecorate, others simply occupy. Vivian set a glass of orange juice beside my plate without being asked. "You slept better," she said. It was not a question. I said. She smiled that particular smile, the one that arrived a half-second too late to be instinctive, and a half-second too early to be calculated. In that narrow gap between genuine and performed, Vivian Calloway had built her entire personality. 20 years as a psychiatric nurse had given her a fluency in the language of care that was nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. Nearly. I had been a structural engineer before I became an architect. I understood load-bearing systems. I understood that what a surface presents and what a surface conceals are engineering decisions, not accidents. Sloane came down at 8. She was still wearing her lab coat, a white one, slightly too large for her frame, with a small ink stain on the left cuff that suggested she had been working since before the rest of the house was awake. Sloane Mercer was 21 years old and carried herself with the flat, contained energy of someone who had learned early that emotions were a liability. She had been living at the Hollows for 4 months, introduced to me by Vivian as her ward, a young woman she had taken in years ago, now finishing her biochemistry degree at UNC Asheville. Brilliant girl, Vivian had said. needed a stable place to work. I had not argued the point. I had reasons of my own for wanting Sloane Mercer close. She went to the refrigerator without greeting me, poured herself a glass of water, and turned. For exactly 2 seconds, her eyes met Vivian's across the kitchen island. It was not the look of a ward and her guardian. It was not even the look of two people who were fond of each other. It was the look of two people who had agreed on something and were checking, silently, that the agreement was still in place. I turned a page of the newspaper. What I knew about Sloane, what I had pieced together before Vivian brought her into this house, was this: Vivian had found her at 15 in a group home in Columbus, Ohio. The kind of underfunded residential facility that cycles children through on a rotating basis and loses track of too many of them. She had taken Sloane in first as a foster arrangement, later informally, and she had done so with a story already constructed and ready to deliver. The story went like this: Sloane's biological father had known she existed from the beginning. He had chosen not to claim her. He had gone on to build a successful career, marry well, live comfortably in a large house in the mountains of North Carolina. While Sloane's mother, a woman named Catherine Shaw, who had left the relationship before she knew she was pregnant, had raised her child alone and died before she could explain any of it. The father's name, according to Vivian, was Edward Calloway. 21 years of growing up with that story. 21 years of shaping a grievance that had been handed to her pre-assembled with citations and a villain already named. By the time Vivian suggested that the appropriate response to such a history might involve a compound that caused gradual targeted memory degradation, introduced subtly over time. Through repeated environmental contact, Sloane had already decided that what she was being asked to do was not a crime. It was a correction. She did not know that every word of the story was a lie. She did not know that Edward Calloway had never known she existed until a private investigator placed a photograph on his desk in October of 2022, 3 weeks after his diagnosis, in response to a search Edward had commissioned himself. She did not know that the woman who had raised her on borrowed hatred had constructed the entire architecture of her motive from nothing, the way a forger constructs a provenance carefully, plausibly with just enough emotional texture to pass inspection. After breakfast, I went upstairs. I was not going to my study. I walked slowly down the third-floor hallway toward the attic stairs, moving the way I always moved now in this house, unhurried, slightly uncertain on the surface. The walk of a man whose mind wandered. The door to Sloane's room was not fully closed. Through the gap, I could see her work table. It was not the work table of a graduate student finishing a thesis. The surface was organized with a precision that went beyond academic habit. Small glass vials arranged by size labels, handwritten in a compact technical notation. A portable centrifuge set to one side, a sealed container I recognized as a low-temperature sample case, the kind used for compound preservation. On the near edge of the table, a row of vials in ascending sizes. The smallest was pale blue. I read the label from where I stood. I remembered it. Back in my study, I opened the laptop and typed the name. The search returned results within seconds: academic papers, toxicological databases, a summary from the National Institutes of Health. I read through the relevant section twice. Then I closed the laptop, slowly. The way you close something when you need a moment before deciding what to do with what you have just learned. I looked down at the hardwood floor beneath my feet, polished to a deep, even shine, the way it had been every morning since Vivian took over the household maintenance 8 months ago. There are two kinds of people who smile that carefully: those who have learned that the world rewards pleasant surfaces, and those who have something beneath the surface they cannot afford to show. That morning, I was fairly certain I knew which category both of them belonged to, and I was beginning to understand that neither of them had arrived here by accident. 0. I told Vivian I had a routine checkup at Mission Hospital on Biltmore Avenue. She kissed my cheek and told me to drive carefully. I drove carefully. I also drove with a sealed envelope on the passenger seat, the results of a private toxicology screening I had requested 3 weeks earlier, using a sample I had taken from Sloane's room while she was sleeping. The drive from the Hollows into Asheville takes 22 minutes on a clear morning. I had made it hundreds of times over the years down the winding mountain access road, past the tree line where the fog lifts onto the boulevard, where the city opens up and the Blue Ridge recedes to a dark suggestion in the rearview mirror. I knew every curve of that road the way I knew the load calculations of every building I had ever designed, by memory, by instinct, by the particular kind of knowing that lives in the body rather than the mind. That was the irony I had been living with for 2 years. The disease that was taking my memory had started in the mind. What was happening to my body had started somewhere else entirely. I pulled into the hospital parking structure on the east side and sat for a moment with the engine off. The morning light came in, flat and cold through the concrete slats. The kind of light that strips away atmosphere and leaves only fact. I picked up the envelope. The report was 4 pages prepared by a private laboratory in Charlotte that specialized in environmental toxicology. I had found them through a colleague at the university, a forensic consultant I had worked with, briefly on a courthouse project in 2019. A man who asked no questions when I explained I needed an independent analysis of an unknown compound. The sample had been collected from the smallest pale blue vial I had seen on Sloane's work table, transferred to a sterile collection tube using the field kit I kept in my study for exactly this kind of contingency. I read the relevant section twice the same way I had read it on the laptop 3 days ago. Then I read it a third time, because some things require that. The compound was synthetic, not commercially available, not listed in standard pharmaceutical databases, but consistent with a class of neurological agents designed for research applications involving acetylcholine receptor suppression. In plain language, it interfered with the brain's ability to form and consolidate short-term memories. It was capable of dermal absorption. It accumulated in peripheral nervous tissue over repeated exposures. And at sufficient concentrations, it produced a documented secondary effect, progressive sensory disruption in the extremities, numbness, nerve pain, the clinical presentation of peripheral neuropathy. I sat in the parking garage and did the arithmetic. September 2022, Alzheimer's diagnosed at Mission Hospital. Symptoms at that point were mild and manageable, occasional word retrieval failures, some spatial disorientation in unfamiliar environments, nothing that had significantly altered my daily function. Dr. Cruz had described the trajectory as slow. She had used the phrase, years of productive capacity, with the careful optimism of someone trained to deliver difficult news without collapsing the patient's sense of future. August 2023. 1 month after the wedding, Vivian arranged for the entire ground floor of the Hollows to be refinished. New wax compound, she had told me. The old formula was leaving streaks. I had not given it a second thought. I had been at that point, still adjusting to the particular surreality of being a newlywed while quietly installing surveillance infrastructure in the walls of my own home. October 2023. The rate of memory loss accelerated. Dr. Cruz noted it at my November appointment and adjusted her prognosis accordingly. I had attributed it as one does to the disease. I should have attributed it to the floors. The appointment with Dr. Martinez was at 9:15. He was my internist distinct from Dr. Cruz, who had delivered the Alzheimer's diagnosis at the neurology clinic 2 years earlier. Martinez handled everything downstream of that diagnosis, the body's secondary responses, the peripheral complications. The systems that a deteriorating central nervous system eventually drags into its orbit. He was a compact, efficient man who practiced internal medicine out of a suite on the 3rd floor, the kind of physician who listened with genuine attention and took notes in a small spiral notebook rather than typing while you spoke. I had been his patient since 2019. He knew my baseline. I described the symptoms I had been experiencing in my feet and lower legs, the numbness that came and went, the occasional sharp sensation along the inner ankle, the feeling, particularly after standing for extended periods, that the floor was not quite solid beneath me. All of these were real. The compound had been doing its secondary work as thoroughly as its primary function. Dr. Martinez examined me with methodical care, ran a brief nerve conduction assessment, and sat back in his chair. "What you're describing is consistent with peripheral neuropathy," he said. "Secondary presentation likely triggered by the neurological changes already underway. It's not uncommon in cases like yours, Edward. The central and peripheral systems talk to each other more than people realize." He paused, wrote something in his notebook. "I want you in proper orthopedic footwear, custom insoles at minimum rigid sole construction. Wear them consistently inside the house as well. Bare feet on hard flooring is a fall risk we don't need to introduce." He printed the prescription and handed it across the desk. I thanked him and left. On the drive back, I thought about the phrase "the floor was not quite solid beneath me." I had said it as a description of a physical symptom. It was also, I realized, the most accurate summary of the last 18 months I could have offered. Vivienne was in the kitchen when I came through the front door. She was arranging flowers dahlias deep orange in the ceramic vase Catherine had brought back from Santa Fe in 2017. Another small act of occupation. I set the prescription printout on the counter without comment. She picked it up, read it, and set it back down. "Oh, sweetheart." Her voice was warm, with the practiced texture of concern. "Peripheral neuropathy on top of everything else. That's a lot to manage." She looked up. "But the doctor knows best. We'll get you sorted with the right shoes." I watched her face. The sympathy was well constructed, the slight furrow of the brow, the tilt of the head, the tone calibrated precisely to caring without being suffocating, and beneath it, visible only because I had spent 18 months learning to read the sub-language of her expressions, something else surfaced for just a moment, and then was gone. Satisfaction, not cruelty, not triumph. Something quieter and more dangerous, the particular satisfaction of a person who has run a controlled experiment and received the result they predicted. The neuropathy was not an accident she was consoling me about. It was a data point she was confirming. She believed the compound was working exactly as intended. That belief would make her careless. That evening in my study, I wrote 4 lines in the notebook I kept, behind the false panel in the 3rd drawer. EWAX, dermal absorption confirmed. Peripheral neuropathy established as medical cover. She believes the progression is on schedule. She will not increase her vigilance. Proceed. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. The orthopedic shoes were already there, thick-soled, custom-fitted. Ordered 10 days ago from a medical supply company in Raleigh when I had first reviewed the toxicology report on my screen and understood what the floors of my own home had been doing to me. I had not waited for the prescription. I had not waited for the confirmation. I had prepared as I always prepared before the moment required it. I placed the shoes beside the bed. From that night forward, not a single barefoot step on the floors of the hollows. I had spent 2 years believing the enemy lived inside my own skull. That night, I understood the enemy had been beneath my feet all along, and she had just been handed a reason to believe her plan was running perfectly. An architect learns to read a building the way a physician reads a patient through the signs it cannot hide. For weeks, the hollows had been showing me symptoms I had been too distracted to diagnose a low vibration beneath the floorboards. After midnight, a current of air moving counter to every vent I had designed. A shadow at the base of the basement stairs that disappeared before I could reach the light switch. The night after I received the toxicology results, I decided to stop ignoring the symptoms. I went down at 11 o'clock. No firearm. I had considered it and decided against if whatever was in the basement had wanted to harm me. It had 14 months of opportunity and had chosen not to use a single one of them. I brought a flashlight, my orthopedic shoes, and the particular steadiness that comes from being a man who has already calculated the worst probable outcome and made his peace with it. The basement of the hollows ran the full footprint of the house concrete foundation over the original World War II substructure, exposed beams, the smell of old mineral water, and iron pipe. I had not redesigned this level. Some foundations are better left as they are. The metal shelving unit along the north wall had been there since I purchased the property. Industrial grade bolted into the concrete. I had stored paint cans and seasonal equipment on it for years without giving it a second thought. Tonight I noticed it was not flush against the wall. 3 millimeters, perhaps 4. Not enough to be visible at a glance, but enough when you knew what you were looking for. To understand that something behind it had been opened and closed many times by someone who was careful, but not perfect. I set the flashlight on the shelf above and pulled. The unit swung outward on a concealed pivot hinge, smooth, well-maintained, the kind of hardware that does not squeak because someone has been oiling it regularly. Behind it, a passage. Low ceiling for the first 2 feet, then it opened into a space that stopped me where I stood. It was not a storage room. It was not a crawl space. It was a residence. The ceiling was 7 feet original World War II, bunker construction, reinforced concrete, with a passive ventilation system running through the old military ductwork that predated the house itself. The air was clean and circulated, carrying no trace of the basement's mineral smell. Along the left wall, a compact cooking station with a single induction burner, a sealed container that served as a cold box, a row of labeled provisions stacked with the organizational discipline of someone who had been doing this long enough to develop a system. Along the right, a folding cot made up with military precision, a shelf of books, a battery lantern. In the far corner, A portable sanitation unit connected by a short length of PVC pipe to a larger system that disappeared into the original foundation. Drainage, the old septic infrastructure of the Army relay station, still functional after 80 years beneath the mountain. And on the wall above, a small desk, a monitor, 6 feeds each cycling through camera angles I recognized as the hidden system I had installed throughout the hollows 2 years ago. He had tapped into my own surveillance network from beneath the floor. I wondered when you'd come down. The voice came from the desk chair. He had been sitting there the entire time, turned slightly away. And I had missed him in the first sweep of the flashlight because he was the kind of man who knew how to occupy a space without announcing himself. He stood as I came forward into the light. Declan Shaw was somewhere in his mid-40s with the lean, deliberate build of someone who stays fit not from vanity, but from the practical understanding that a body is a tool. His eyes had the particular quality of a person, long accustomed to low light, adjusted patient-taking in the detail without appearing to look. I had last seen him 11 years ago at the closing, when I purchased the hollows. He had been the security systems contractor, a recommendation from the property's previous owner. A man with a precise understanding of every circuit, every camera blind spot, every structural cavity in the building he had spent 2 years wiring. I had hired him to design and install the full security infrastructure. He had done the work thoroughly professionally, and at the time, I had not thought much about the fact that a man who maps every inch of a building's hidden anatomy retains that map long after the contract ends. How long, I asked. 14 months, since October 2023. The same month my memory had begun accelerating its decline. And the supply route, I said. It was not quite a question. Western tree line, 2 kilometers of old forestry trail to a fire road. I keep the truck on the far side. I come in at 3 in the morning once a week, never above the basement level. He said it matter-of-factly the way an engineer describes a system he built and trusts. The ventilation runs off the original Army ductwork independent circuit, no connection to the house above. Nothing comes up. I looked at the monitor. On one of the feeds I could see the upstairs hallway, the yellow sticky notes still on the wall, small and illegible at this resolution. On another, the kitchen. On a third, the exterior front drive. I looked at the desk surface, papers, handwritten pages organized in dated stacks, observation logs, movement patterns, times and routes and behavioral notes in a compact, legible hand that spoke of someone trained to document. "You've been watching them," I said. "I've been watching everything." I turned back to him. There was a particular quality to his stillness, not the stillness of someone who was calm, but the stillness of someone who had been carrying a great deal of weight for a very long time, and had learned not to let it show in his posture. "You're here because of Catherine," I said. He looked at me directly for the first time. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, a tectonic thing deep and slow. "You killed my sister Calloway." I looked around the bunker again. The logs, the maps, the monitor cycling through every room of my house. This man had been here longer than anyone knew. He had documented more than anyone had thought to document. And whatever he believed about me and Catherine, he had spent 14 months using that knowledge to watch the same 2 women I had been watching. I had come down here expecting to find a threat. Instead, I found a man who hated me with the specific, well-maintained hatred of someone who had been given a great deal of time to tend it, and who, despite everything, had spent 14 months standing watch over a house that had once belonged to his sister. We sat across from each other in the bunker, with 2 cups of coffee Declan had brewed on his camp stove. Black, no sugar, the way men drink coffee when they are not trying to make it into a ceremony. Neither of us spoke for a long time. When you have rehearsed a confrontation for the better part of 2 years, and the person finally sits across from you, the practiced words tend not to fit the actual room. He spoke first. "August of last year," he said. "That's when the girl started adding it to the wax compound. I watched her do it twice, once in the utility room off the kitchen, once up in her workspace. She was precise about it, measured, like a lab procedure, not like someone improvising." I said nothing. I had already confirmed the compound. What I needed from Declan was not the what, but the when and the how much. The money started moving in November, small transfers at first amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic review. Vivian has 3 intermediate accounts, one in Raleigh, one through a financial services company registered in Delaware, one I haven't been able to trace yet. He said this without apology for the gap in his knowledge, which I noted. A man who acknowledges what he doesn't know is a more reliable source than one who fills the gaps with guesses. And the woman in the walls? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but less contained. First time I saw her, I nearly came out of the bunker. She was moving through the service corridor on the second floor just past the linen room. The light was low, and she had the same height. The same way of holding her shoulders. He stopped. It took me a full 30 seconds to understand she wasn't Catherine. I looked at my coffee. She's been surgically altered, he said. I don't know how extensive it is, but Vivian brought her in 6 months ago, and she has not left the house through any of the main exits since. She moves inside the walls, literally through the service passages, mostly at night. I think she's being used to create the impression of something, a presence. I filed that away. Task for another night. Tell me about 2006, I said. He looked at me. You know about that, he said. It was not a question. I know Catherine left me in 2007 without a reason I could understand. I know she went into a period of treatment the year before. I know Vivian's employment history includes a psychiatric nursing position in Asheville around that time. The rest, I'm asking you to tell me. Declan set his cup down. For a moment, he looked at the wall, at the map of the Hollows, with its handwritten annotations, the observation logs stacked in dated order, the accumulated evidence of 14 months of solitary watching. Catherine was admitted for outpatient treatment in 2006, he said. Anxiety and depression, she'd been managing it quietly for years. You know how she was about not making a fuss. Vivienne was a newly qualified psychiatric nurse on the evening rotation. She was 24, sharp good at making patients feel understood. He said this last part, the way you describe a weapon's design, appreciatively and without warmth. She spent 6 months getting close to Catherine. After that, things started going wrong between you two. What kind of things? The kind you can't argue against because you can't see them. Catherine came to believe you'd grown distant, that you were pulling away, that the work had become more important than the marriage. He paused. She also came to believe, and I don't know exactly how Vivian managed this, that you had been seeing someone else. Nothing explicit, just a weight of small suggestions over time. The kind that don't feel like manipulation because each individual piece seems like something you noticed yourself. I sat with that for a moment. Vivian would have been 24 years old, fresh out of her nursing program, working evening rotations in a psychiatric unit. Young enough to be underestimated. Trained in the precise vocabulary of emotional vulnerability. And patient God, she was patient. Everything I had observed in 18 months of marriage pointed to a woman for whom patience was not a virtue, but a methodology. Yet Catherine didn't know, I said. She never knew. She left you in 2007 because she genuinely believed the marriage had failed on its own terms, not because anyone had engineered it. He looked at me directly. She spent the last years of her life thinking she had made the right call. That was the one mercy in it. I did not respond to that. There was nothing to say that would not sound like self-defense, and this was not the moment for self-defense. What do you want, Shaw? I asked. I want them to pay for what they've done to this family. He said family the way people say words that used to mean something larger than they currently do, carefully aware of the diminishment. So do I. He reached across the desk and placed a photograph face up on the surface between us. A candid shot, Catherine laughing at something off camera outdoors somewhere, the mountains behind her. The photo was worn at the edges in the way photographs get worn when they have been handled often. I didn't let her die, I said quietly. I failed to save her. Those are two different things. Declan looked at the photograph for a long moment. He did not agree with me, but he did not argue either, and from a man who had been sustaining a specific grievance for 3 years, that silence was its own kind of statement. She said something about you, he said finally, a few months before she got sick. We were on the phone and she brought you up out of nowhere. He picked up the photograph and held it without looking at it. She said Edward will never forgive himself. Don't let him become a man who has nothing left but that. I turned away from him and looked at the near wall. We did not shake hands. We did not make any formal declaration. We simply stood at the same time and stood together looking at the map of the Hollows, its corridors and cavities, its hidden systems and its surface rooms, the whole intricate anatomy of a house that both of us knew better than we knew most people. I left the bunker carrying something I had not brought down with me, not quite a plan and not quite an ally. Only the voice of a woman who had clearly understood both of us better than we had ever understood ourselves, and the beginning of something that felt uncomfortably like the opposite of being alone. After meeting Declan, I observed the hollows differently, not the way a frightened man watches a dark room braced reactive waiting for something to lunge. The way an architect watches a structure he suspects is failing, methodically tracing each anomaly back to its source, building a diagnosis from evidence rather than instinct. 2 weeks later, the first clear evidence appeared. I had positioned myself in the east guest room each night for the better part of those 2 weeks. Door open 3 inches, no light. The reading chair angled to give me a sightline down the full length of the second-floor corridor, with the large antique mirror at the far end serving as a secondary viewing angle. I had installed that mirror in 2014 beveled glass mahogany frame, chosen by Catherine from a salvage yard outside of Weaverville on a Saturday afternoon, when we had nothing more pressing to do than drive mountain roads and look at old things. I knew every inch of its frame, which is why I noticed during a careful inspection the week after my conversation with Declan that the left edge carried a hairline seam that had not been there before. The kind produced when something is removed and reattached multiple times by someone who is careful but cannot entirely erase the evidence of repetition. On the 14th night at 2 a.m, a pale shape moved across the glass. Not a reflection moving through the hallway, a figure visible inside the mirror itself in the narrow service passage behind it, present for no more than 2 seconds before the darkness closed around it again. I was through the guest room door and into the corridor before the shape had fully resolved. The release mechanism was built into the decorative molding along the inner frame edge, a pressure latch disguised as an ornamental detail. The kind of modification that required someone with genuine knowledge of architectural joinery to execute without leaving obvious marks. I pressed it. The mirror swung inward on a concealed piano hinge. Behind it, a service corridor 18 inches wide, running parallel to the hallway before angling toward the rear stairwell. The original World War II, era brick walls, cold plaster. A thin LED strip along the baseboard, providing just enough light to navigate. The air had the dense stillness of a space used regularly, but never inhabited the specific quality of a place that exists only in transit. She was pressed against the far wall when I came through 10 feet in. Young, mid-20s slight, dressed in pale gray that had clearly been selected for its low visibility and dim light. And her face. Declan had described it, and I had understood the description, but description and direct encounter are separated by a distance that words cannot fully cross. The surgical work was skilled, not theatrical, not a Halloween approximation, but a precise calibration of specific features, the jawline, the brow line, the angle of the nose and profile. Taken individually, none of it was extraordinary. Assembled together, viewed at low light in a moment of disorientation, it was designed to trigger one specific recognition in one specific viewer. A 60-year-old man with early-stage Alzheimer's who had lost his wife 3 years earlier and could not always trust what his eyes reported. I understood the entire construction in the moment I saw her face. The clinical term is gaslighting, a word borrowed from a 1944 film, but describing a practice far older. The deliberate manipulation of a person's environment to cause them to doubt their own perceptions, memory, and sanity. What Vivian had built inside the walls of my house was a physical gaslighting instrument, a presence engineered to be glimpsed at thresholds of visibility, seen in mirrors, caught in peripheral vision, never quite present enough to confirm, never quite absent enough to dismiss. A man who believed he was seeing his dead wife moving through the corridors at night was a man whose account of anything else, financial irregularities, document fraud. A biometric theft would be received with professional sympathy and quiet disbelief. The girl's eyes were locked on me. Her breathing was shallow and fast. "Who hired you?" I asked. A long pause, then she spoke the name I already knew. I reached into the pocket of my robe. I kept a reserve of cash in the house, a habit formed over decades of construction management, where small immediate payments accomplish what purchase orders cannot. I counted out $300. "There is a hotel on Merriman Avenue," I said. "The Applewood Inn. Check in tonight. Stay 2 nights. After that, go wherever you need to go." I held out the bills. "Do not come back to this house." She looked at the money, then at me. Her expression was not what I had expected, not relief, not calculation. Something closer to exhaustion. "Ike, she told me you were losing your mind," she said quietly. "I know exactly what she told you." I kept my hand extended. I'm giving you the opportunity to leave before this becomes something you can't walk away from cleanly. That window is brief. She took the money. Within a minute, her footsteps had faded toward the rear stairwell, and I was alone in the service corridor with one palm flat against the cold plaster wall, listening to a house that had just revealed another layer of itself. I went down to the bunker. Declan was at his desk. I gave him the account. He listened in the way I had come to recognize as characteristic, completely still processing without any visible reaction until I finished. Then he reached beneath the desk and set an object between us. A small rectangular device, matte black casing, a glass sensor panel on one face approximately 2 inches square, a biometric fingerprint scanner, the type deployed in high-security private banking systems, as a secondary authentication layer for accounts requiring identity confirmation beyond a password or PIN. In the United States, certain trust structures and private asset accounts use registered biometric data to authorize significant transactions. A beneficiary change, a major transfer, a modification to the account's controlling instrument. The fingerprint captured at account opening must be matched again to execute. Without the matching print, the authorization does not go through. I pulled it from her office 3 days ago, Declan said. She's preparing to present you with estate documents. Routine updates is how she'll frame it. This device accompanies the signing. Your fingerprint on that sensor authorizes a transfer of controlling interest in a private asset account. How much? $4.2 million, consolidated across 3 instruments, all titled in your name, all convertible on biometric authorization. I set the device back on the desk carefully without touching the sensor panel. How long before she moves? I asked. Declan was quiet for a moment. Weeks, not months. She's been patient for a long time. That kind of patience has a limit, and I think she's approaching it. Then we move first. I climbed back upstairs and stood in the hallway before the mirror, the same mirror now closed again, giving back nothing but my own reflection in the dim light. For the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, the face looking back at me was one I recognized without effort. It was not a comfortable face. It held no particular peace. But it was present, and it was clear, and it knew precisely what it was going to have to do next. I did not like what that was going to require, but it was the only face in the hollows that could do it. December came to Asheville with the first true frost of the season, the kind that coats the Blue Ridge overnight and leaves the valley below, looking as though it belongs to a different century. I had been spending my December nights doing something I prepared 2 years earlier and waited for, without fully knowing I was waiting until the moment arrived. The notebook had been sitting in the back of my kitchen freezer since October 2022, not concealed behind anything, resting in plain view between a bag of frozen corn and a container of stock I had made the previous winter and never touched. Vivienne reorganized the freezer twice after moving in. She moved the stock, she discarded the corn, she never opened the notebook, because it looked precisely like what it appeared to be, a worn black field journal of the kind sold in art supply stores, water-stained elastic closure fraying at the spine. Nothing worth examining. I pulled it out at 2 in the morning and set it on the counter. The science behind it was straightforward. Thermochromic ink responds to temperature rather than light, below roughly 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The pages appear completely blank. As the material warms toward room temperature, the writing gradually emerges. The technology itself was not unusual. Thermochromic compounds had been used in commercial printing for decades. Applied to packaging labels, security documents, and novelty products that revealed hidden text under specific thermal conditions. I had adapted it for a more personal application. A journal that read as empty required no hiding place and invited no curiosity. I watched the counter and waited. The first lines appeared after 4 minutes. My own handwriting steadier than it was, now the letters sitting with more confidence on their invisible baseline. Reading it felt like receiving a letter from someone I had known well and lost contact with. Recognition and a particular distance. This was not a diary. It was an instruction manual. Each entry followed the same structure. What I knew at the time of writing, what I suspected, what steps I had already taken, and what the reader, meaning a future version of myself, should do next if the previous steps had been forgotten. It was written by a man who understood he was writing for someone who might need to be led rather than merely reminded. Page 12 stopped me. Dated October 19th, 2022, 26 days after my diagnosis. The handwriting was deliberate, slightly more formal than the surrounding entries. as though I had recognized this page would need to read clearly to a man considerably less capable than the one writing it. 3 weeks after the diagnosis, I hired a private investigator to review my own history, not because I suspected anyone, because I wanted to know everything knowable before I lost the capacity to want to know. His name is on the inside back cover. He found a record in Columbus, Ohio, a child admitted to the Franklin County Residential Care System in late 2003, mother listed as Catherine Shaw. Father, unknown. Catherine left in the spring of 2002. I did not know she was pregnant. We had already separated when it must have happened, and she said nothing, not to hurt me. But because she had already decided the situation was hers alone to carry, that was entirely consistent with who she was. The child's name in the admission record is Sloan. She was placed in the system several months before Catherine's death. Her name now is Sloan Mercer. She is enrolled in a biochemistry program. She is 19 years old. I set the notebook down and looked at the frost-covered yard through the kitchen window. The sky was beginning its slow shift from black toward gray. Page 15 carried a shorter note in red ink, added in March 2023. Vivienne located Sloan in 2017 when the girl was approximately 14. Vivienne told her that her biological father had known of her existence from the beginning and had chosen not to claim her, that he had continued living well while her mother died without support. Sloan has carried this for 6 years. She believes she is delivering justice for Catherine. She is not. She is a tool given a false account and a specific technical skill set, and pointed at a target she has no reason to question. Whatever she has done inside this house, she was handed a fabricated map and told it was the truth. She has been navigating by it since she was 14 years old. Do not forget that distinction. The final line on that page was written in a slightly looser hand, added last I suspected, when the fatigue of that session had already set in. If you are reading this, you are still capable. Do not waste it on hatred or grief. There is work to be done. I sat with the notebook open on the counter and looked at nothing in particular. I was not thinking about Vivienne. I was not running timelines or reviewing next steps. I was thinking about a child who had spent 6 years carrying a portrait of a father who had chosen not to want her. A portrait drawn by someone else handed to her as history, and tended carefully until it had become the foundation of her entire sense of what was right and what needed correcting. 2 years ago, I had written myself a note about a girl I had not yet met. I sat in the dark and tried to understand what it meant to owe someone a truth they had never been given the chance to hear. I had hired Marcus Reynolds in January of 2023, 1 month before I met Vivienne and 6 months before the wedding. The original mandate had nothing to do with her specifically. After the diagnosis, I had instructed him to conduct a standing background audit on anyone entering my professional or social circle during the period of my heightened vulnerability, a precaution against exactly the category of person Vivienne turned out to be. When she appeared at the Biltmore fundraiser in February, Reynolds was already on retainer. I redirected his attention within the week. By March of 2024, I understood that the attention had been flowing the wrong way entirely. By March of 2024, I had my answer. It simply was not the answer Reynolds had provided. The French Broad Chocolate Lounge occupied a narrow storefront on Lexington Avenue in the River Arts District. Exposed brick walls, low lighting. The smell of dark chocolate and coffee layered over the particular warmth of a room that was always full of people who had chosen it, specifically because it felt nothing like an office. I had suggested it deliberately. A man like Reynolds would be more comfortable in a place with ambient noise and visual complexity. More comfortable meant less careful. He was already seated when I arrived. The report centered on the table in front of him, with the practiced placement of someone who understood that presentation was part of the service. 12 pages, spiral-bound tabbed sections. He stood briefly as I sat, the kind of automatic courtesy that comes from training rather than genuine regard. "I appreciate you making the time," he said. I told him it was no trouble and ordered a coffee I did not intend to drink. The report was thorough in the way that forgeries are thorough attention, concentrated on surface detail. The underlying structure assembled to support a predetermined conclusion rather than to follow evidence wherever it led. Reynolds walked me through it, section by section, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who had delivered professional assessments many times and knew exactly how much gravity to project. The language throughout was clinical, Accelerating cognitive disruption, confirmation bias consistent with early-stage neurological decline, disproportionate suspicion toward a caregiving spouse. I read it the way I had learned to read structural reports prepared by contractors who wanted to tell me something was sound before I signed a payment authorization, with attention to what was precise and equal attention to what was conspicuously absent. Reynolds had been following Vivienne for 14 months, according to his billing records. 14 months of surveillance. And his report contained not one reference to the financial transfers Declan had been tracking since the previous November. Not one reference to Sloane's laboratory equipment. Not one reference to the service corridor behind the second-floor mirror, which had been in active use for the better part of 3 months. A private investigator who had genuinely been watching Vivienne Calloway for over a year and missed all of that was not a private investigator, he was a set designer. But what confirmed it was not the absences in the report. It was Reynolds himself. He answered every question without hesitation. Not the natural fluency of someone telling the truth, which carries its own texture, small pauses at unexpected moments, minor self-corrections. The slight friction of a person retrieving actual memory rather than reciting prepared material. Reynolds was frictionless. He moved through the conversation the way a well-rehearsed actor moves through a scene he has performed, enough times that the effort is no longer visible. It was a skilled performance. It simply was not a true one. I nodded at the appropriate moments. I asked the questions a genuinely concerned and somewhat confused husband would ask. Reynolds answered them all. And by the time we shook hands in the doorway, I had given him nothing he could report back that would alter Vivienne's current assessment of where I stood. I watched him walk toward his car. Then I sat back down, ordered a second coffee, and opened the burner phone. Declan and I had been using since February, a prepaid device purchased with cash registered to no name, kept charged in the bunker, and exchanged in the dead drop Declan had established beneath the loose stone at the western tree line. The only number stored in it was Declan's matching device. The message had arrived 40 minutes earlier. A photograph, a restaurant interior, warm lighting, white tablecloths. 2 people at a corner table, Reynolds on the left. His jacket over the chair back, relaxed in the way people are relaxed in the company of someone they know well. Vivienne on the right, leaning slightly forward, one hand near her wine glass. The photograph had been taken 3 days ago at Table, a restaurant in Biltmore Village that I knew for its quiet corners and its discretion, the kind of place where Asheville's professional class conducted conversations they preferred not to have overheard. They were laughing about something. I looked at the photograph for a moment. Then I set the phone down, picked up Reynolds' business card from where I had left it beside my cup, and held it over the glass ashtray on the table edge. The flame from the matchbook the cafe kept near the condiment stand took it cleanly. The server at the adjacent station glanced over with mild alarm. I left a tip that was double the bill and walked out. The Blue Ridge Parkway in late March carried the particular atmosphere of a season that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Bare trees on the upper ridgelines. The first pale suggestions of green in the lower hollows. The late afternoon light coming in at a low angle that turned the fog in the gaps between peaks into something that looked almost solid. I called Declan from the overlook, where I sometimes pulled over. Reynolds is confirmed, I said. I know. A pause. What do you want to do? I looked at the mountains going gray in the early dusk. The question was a reasonable one. Reynolds could be confronted, reported, cut off. Any of those actions would send a signal to Vivienne. To whatever network of professional relationships she had assembled, to any institutional system, she had already begun preparing as a backstop against the possibility that her plan went sideways. A signal meant a response. A response meant acceleration. Nothing yet, I said. Let her believe the report landed. Let her believe I'm exactly as confused as she needs me to be. Silence on the line. Then, that's a harder thing to maintain than it sounds. I know what it sounds like. I started the engine. From this point, Declan, it's only the 2 of us. I know, he said. It always was. I drove back toward the hollows through the darkening mountains and felt for the first time since the diagnosis something that was not quite the absence of fear, but was the thing that sometimes replaces it, a clarity that comes from knowing precisely what is ahead of you, even when what is ahead of you is not good. The most dangerous moment in any load-bearing structure is not the collapse itself. It is the moment just before, when everything appears stable, but the fractures are already running silently through the core. I drove home through the mountains and prepared to look exactly like a stable structure. Spring came to the Blue Ridge the way it always did. the dogwoods along the parkway opening overnight, as though someone had given a signal, the morning fog burning off earlier each day, the whole mountain range softening from its winter gray into something that looked almost forgiving. Inside the hollows, Vivienne was blooming too. I could feel her patience thinning, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, not through any single indicator, but through the cumulative weight of small signals that the air itself was shifting. She had been preparing something all winter. In April, she began to move. I was reading in the front parlor when she came in. She carried the folder, the way people carry things they want to appear casual about, under one arm, slightly behind her, as though it had arrived with her almost accidentally. She set it on the oak table by the window, where the late afternoon light came in amber through the tall glass, and she smoothed the front cover with the flat of her hand in a gesture that had nothing to do with the paper and everything to do with composure. "Just some estate planning documents," she said. Her voice had the particular texture she deployed when she wanted something to sound routine warm but businesslike. The tone of a competent person managing practical matters on behalf of someone who had more important things to think about. The accountant mentioned it would be sensible to review the asset allocation while your pause calibrated. The sentence ended in the space where a specific word had been omitted with deliberate care. The word was lucid. She did not say it. She did not need to. I looked at the folder. Then I looked at the table beside it. The device was positioned to the right of the document stack, placed with the studied casualness of something meant to appear incidental. Matte black casing. Glass sensor panel on its face identical in every external dimension to the one Declan and I had been working with for the past 3 weeks. Vivienne had retrieved the original from her desk drawer, apparently without noticing the substitute Declan had left in its place. She had no reason to examine it closely. As far as she knew, it was exactly what she had put there. What she did not know was that Declan had spent the better part of 2 weeks fabricating a replacement using components sourced through 3 separate suppliers, none of them traceable to the hollows. The duplicate matched the original in weight dimensions, surface texture, and LED indicator behavior. It did not match it in function. The sensor panel recorded nothing. The internal transmitter sent nothing. It was in engineering terms a shellless structure with a convincing exterior and nothing load-bearing inside. I had carried it in my left jacket pocket since breakfast. I pulled my reading glasses from my breast pocket and opened the folder with the slow deliberateness of a man who found paperwork taxing but was making the effort. The documents were well-prepared real legal language, real account numbers, structured around what appeared to be a routine amendment to a revocable living trust. In North Carolina, a revocable trust can be amended at any time by the grantor, while the grantor retains legal capacity. What the documents before me actually accomplished, buried in the subordinate clauses of page 4 and cross-referenced to an addendum on page 9, was a transfer of controlling interest across 4 separate asset instruments, totaling the full appraised value of the Hollows and its associated holdings. The language was precise enough to pass a cursory review, and opaque enough to require a specialist to untangle on short notice. It was in other terms elder financial abuse a category of crime under North Carolina. General Statute 14-112.2, which specifically addresses the fraudulent appropriation of assets from a mentally incapacitated adult through deception or undue influence. The documents had been designed to look like estate maintenance. They were designed to function as a transfer of everything I owned. I initialed 3 pages. I signed the 4th. I set the pen down and reached toward the device with my right hand, letting my fingers approach the sensor panel, and in the same motion, with my left hand resting on the folder edge, I completed the exchange. The real device came out of my jacket pocket as the false one went in. The movement took approximately 2 seconds. I had practiced it enough times in the bunker that the mechanics were no longer conscious. My right index finger pressed the sensor panel of the original device. The LED indicator pulsed once green. Vivienne's smile arrived with the quality of something that had been held in reserve for a long time and was finally permitted to surface. Not large, not theatrical. The quiet, controlled satisfaction of a person who has executed a complex plan and reached its critical node without incident. She picked up the folder, straightened the pages, and thanked me in the tone she used when something had gone exactly as she intended. "I'll have the accountant file these tomorrow," she said. Across the room, Sloane stood near the archway to the kitchen, a glass of water in her hand. She had not moved or spoken during the entire exchange. Her eyes went from the device to Vivienne's face and back, once then fixed on a point somewhere past my left shoulder. She was not drinking the water. That evening, I went down to the bunker. Declan connected the device to his laptop through an interface cable he had assembled from components in his kit. The authentication system it was linked to used a two-stage verification, biometric capture plus a secondary PIN that Vivienne had presumably already entered remotely through her own access point. With both stages satisfied by the original device's capture, the account portal opened on his screen. We read through it without speaking. 4 asset instruments. The Hollow's property and improvements appraised at $2.8 million. 3 associated financial accounts, combined balance of $1.4 million. Total, $4.2 million. Scheduled transfer authorization, November 2024. Beneficiary designation, an LLC registered in Delaware 18 months ago, which Declan had been unable to fully trace in February, but which we now had the internal account reference to pursue. 7 months, I said. 7 months, Declan confirmed. We sat in the bunker together and looked at the number on the screen. The ventilation system moved air quietly through the old military ductwork above our heads. And somewhere upstairs, the house settled with the particular sound old structures make when the temperature drops after dark. 7 months. I had designed entire buildings in less time than that. The question was not whether 7 months was sufficient. The question was whether I would retain enough of myself to finish what I had started, and whether the person I most needed to protect had yet understood that she needed protecting at all. After the fingerprint trap, I found myself doing something I had never written into any version of the plan, watching Sloan Mercer the way you watch someone you owe a debt to. Not money, not action. The kind of debt that has no clear method of payment and no fixed due date, except that the due date was now visible on a screen in the bunker, and it read November 2024. I had been watching her for weeks before I admitted to myself what I was actually doing. It was easiest in the early mornings before Vivienne came downstairs. The second-floor hallway mirror that I had reclaimed from its use as a passage gave me a clean sightline to the attic stairwell, and from the landing I could observe the gap of light beneath Sloane's door. She was an early riser up before 6 most days. The sound of movement beginning, while the Blue Ridge outside was still a dark suggestion against a darker sky. On a Tuesday morning, in the second week of May, I positioned myself at the observation point and looked through. She was sitting on the floor, back against the foot of the bed, knees drawn up, laptop, open on the boards beside her, but the screen untouched and gone to sleep on its own. She was holding something small, rectangular, the size of a photograph. I could not see the image from my angle, but I did not need to. I had seen the photographs Vivienne kept in the file Declan had copied from her office records. Catherine, at perhaps 35, standing somewhere outdoors, her hair loose, caught mid-laugh at something beyond the frame. Sloane's expression at 6 in the morning, when she believed no one was watching, was not what I had seen across the kitchen table for 4 months. The careful neutrality she maintained in shared spaces, the flat, contained affect of someone who had learned to keep her interior weather off her face, was entirely absent. What remained was something I did not have a ready name for. Not grief exactly, not anger. The expression of a person who has grown up with a story about someone they never met and does not know how much of the story to believe, and carries that uncertainty the way you carry a weight whose actual measure you have never been permitted to check. I stood at the observation point for 15 minutes without moving. In the bunker below, Declan was watching the same hallway on his monitor. I learned this later when he told me with the particular dryness he applied to observations he found significant. You stood there for a quarter of an hour, old man. I wasn't sure if you were running surveillance or something else entirely. I did not have a clean answer for him. The afternoon was warm for early June, the kind of Carolina afternoon that arrives without the humidity of high summer and makes the mountains look closer than they are. The ridgelines sharp against a sky that had gone a deep, uncomplicated blue. Sloane was on the back steps when I came out with the watering can for the kitchen herbs Catherine had originally planted in the window boxes along the rear terrace. I had kept them going for 3 years out of a habit I had never examined closely. She did not move when I came out, did not perform the casual repositioning people do when they are caught in a private moment and want to appear as though they were not having one. She simply remained where she was, one arm resting on the upper step, watching something in the middle distance that I could not identify. I sat down 2 steps below her and attended to the herbs. Does this house ever feel like it's watching you?" she asked. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Every single day," I said. She nodded once, the nod of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already privately concluded. We sat together for another 10 minutes and did not speak. The birds in the tree line beyond the rear garden were making the particular racket of early summer, and the light on the mountains was the long, warm light of late afternoon, and it was objectively a pleasant place to sit. Under other circumstances, it might have felt like nothing more than that. Before she stood to go back inside, she stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "She told me that you knew about me," Sloane said. Her voice was level, not accusatory, not fragile. The voice of someone asking a question they have been carrying for long enough that the weight of it has become familiar. "Before I was born, that you chose not to." I looked at her directly. She was watching me with the careful attention of a person who has been given incomplete information for a long time and has developed a precise sensitivity to the gap between what someone says and what they mean. "She told you a great many things," I said. "Was any of it true?" I held the watering can in both hands and thought about the 15 pages of thermochromic ink I had read in December, about the investigator's file from Columbus, about a woman who had left in 2002 without telling me the reason, and a child placed in the care of a county system several months before that woman died, and 6 years of a fabricated history handed to a 14-year-old girl as though it were fact. "Some of it," I said, "not the parts that matter." Sloane looked at me for a long moment. The afternoon light was behind her, which meant I could see her face clearly, while my own was in shadow, an architectural accident that I noted without intending to. Her expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted, the way a door shifts when a latch releases without yet swinging open. Then she went inside. That evening, Vivian set 3 places at the dinner table as usual. She and I ate at 7, at 8. She went upstairs and came back down with a slight tightness around her eyes that she smoothed over before sitting again. Sloane's door had been closed since 5 o'clock. It remained closed through dinner. A tray I left outside, it nothing elaborate soup and bread, placed quietly without knocking, was taken in sometime after 9. The door did not open again that night. I had not answered her question fully, but I had told her in the only way available to me at that moment that an answer existed and that it was different from everything she had been given. Sometimes that is enough to begin a different kind of listening, the kind that eventually leads someone to ask the second question. July in the Blue Ridge held its heat inside the valleys, like something unwilling to release its grip. The kind of summer that pressed down through the tree canopy and made the mountain air feel dense and close even after dark. I had been spending my July nights operating a system I had built in October of 2022, that first month after the diagnosis, when I was still entirely myself and needed to find a way to leave instructions for the version of me that might not be entirely myself anymore. I had never played it for Declan. On a Thursday night in the second week of July, I left the interchannel connection open. The system had been Declan's engineering work executed in the weeks before. I had any reason to suspect Vivian specifically before she had entered my life at all. In the autumn of 2022, when the diagnosis was still raw and the implications of it were still being sorted into categories of manageable and not, I had contacted a specialist in AI voice synthesis through a colleague at the university's digital media department. The technology had become sufficiently advanced by that point to accomplish what I needed, a process called voice cloning, in which a substantial archive of recorded speech interviews, lectures, dictated notes, the hours of audio I had accumulated over decades of professional documentation is analyzed by a machine learning system to build a complete acoustic model of a specific voice. From that model, the system can generate new speech, new sentences, new paragraphs, new recordings, in the speaker's own voice reading text that the speaker has never actually spoken aloud. The result was not perfect. A careful listener who knew my voice well would detect something slightly considered about the pacing, a smoothness in the transitions between sentences that the natural voice does not always maintain. But for the purpose, I had designed it for a set of recorded instructions reminders, and personal notes intended to be played back to a man whose memory was in the process of becoming unreliable. It was more than sufficient. The voice in the recordings sounded like me at full capacity, clear, precise, present in the way I was less reliably present now. Declan had installed the hardware, a dedicated audio processor connected to the secure channel between my private study and the bunker's communication panel, separate from the surveillance feed, accessible from either end. We had set it up in November of 2022, and I had been adding recordings to it ever since. I sat in the study at midnight with the door secured and played the archive from the beginning. My own voice filled the room, 2 years younger, the consonants landing with a surety that I noticed now by its contrast to how they sometimes arrive these days. It read through the structured sections, methodically property documentation, legal contacts, the sequence of prepared responses to various contingencies. I listened and made notes in the margins of my current working document, checking what had been executed against what had been planned. Then the archive reached the section I had recorded on the night of October 3rd, 2022, 18 days after the diagnosis, a section I had not labeled in the index. "I don't entirely know what I'm building," the voice said. "I know the structural elements, I know the legal components and the security components and the contingency protocols. But what I'm really building is a set of conditions under which the truth becomes unavoidable for the people who need to encounter it and for myself." Catherine used to say that the best buildings are the ones that bring people together, even when they don't want to be brought together. I'm trying to build something like that. I don't know how much time I have left. I don't know how much of myself will remain when the time runs out, but I am trying. I sat with the recording after it ended and did not immediately move to the next section. In the bunker below the inter-channel connection I had left open was carrying everything. Declan had accessed the communication panel. At some point in the previous hour, the indicator light on my end had registered an incoming connection that I had noted and chosen not to close. I was aware he was there. Whether he had connected by accident or intention, I could not say with certainty, and I had concluded it did not matter. There are things that need to be heard by more than one person, and the architecture of how the hearing happens is sometimes less important than the fact of it. The channel stayed open for the duration of the archive. When I shut down the system and stepped into the hallway, the light from the bunker access point was still showing through the gap in the floor panel, the thin line of amber that meant the lamp at Declan's desk was on. I stood over it for a moment, then I knocked 3 times on the floor with my knuckle. No return knock. I went to bed. In the morning, there was a folded piece of paper on the floor just inside my study door. A single line, written in the compact hand I had come to recognize from 14 months of handwritten observation logs. "She was right about you. Don't waste what you have left." No signature. He had never been a man who signed things he felt should be self-evident. I stood in the early light of my study and read the line twice. Then I folded the paper along its original crease and placed it in the breast pocket of my shirt against the left side, where it stayed for the remainder of the day without my touching it again. It was the first morning since Catherine died that I did not feel entirely alone inside the hollows. I had built the system to help myself remember. I had not calculated that in doing so. I might also help someone else remember something, or that what they remembered would quietly shift the weight of everything we were carrying together, without ceremony and without announcement, in the way that the best structural repairs have always worked. August in the Blue Ridge held its heat the way certain silences hold their meaning, not loudly, but with a weight that accumulated over days until you could no longer ignore it. Inside, the hollows. Vivienne had been patient for 16 months. I could feel that patience reaching its terminal point, the way you feel a structure approaching its load limit, not through any single sign, but through the aggregate of small indicators that something was being asked to bear more than it was designed to carry. I had been watching Vivienne's study for 3 weeks. The room was on the east side of the second floor, smaller than the other main rooms, originally a sitting room that she had converted to an office within 2 months of moving in. It contained nothing personal. No photographs, no objects carried from a previous life, no evidence of aesthetic preference beyond the functional. It was the room of a person who understood that personal effects were information and had chosen not to provide any. Through the observation point behind the east wing mirror, I had a partial sightline to the desk and the door. On a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of August, she called Sloane in. I watched from the observation point as Vivienne settled into the chair behind the desk, with the particular composure of someone who has rehearsed a scene enough times that the performance has become indistinguishable from the real thing. She placed a document on the desk surface, not a thin sheaf of papers, but a bound portfolio, the kind produced by an estate attorney's office carrying the visual authority of official process. The document bore my name as testator. It had been prepared without my knowledge or participation. What Vivienne was describing in language carefully stripped of its legal implications, Was nominee ownership a structure designed to receive a transfer of assets and disperse them through a sequence of subsidiary accounts that would make the origin of the funds progressively harder to trace? Under federal law, this constituted money laundering. Under North Carolina General Statute 14-119, the document itself was a Class H felony. Sloan, if she signed, would become the instrument legally liable, regardless of whether she understood the mechanism. Sloan sat across from her. I could see her profile, the particular stillness she maintained in Vivian's presence, the expression she had worn for months that gave nothing away. She nodded at the end of Vivian's presentation. She said she would look over the documents. She picked up the portfolio and carried it out of the room without signing anything. What I noted watching Sloan leave was not the refusal to sign. It was her hands. Both palms had been flat on the desk edge the entire time. Fingers slightly curled the controlled, isometric pressure of someone holding something in that they had decided not to release yet. Vivian watched her go with the recalibration of someone who had expected a different response and was quietly adjusting the timeline. I stepped back from the observation point and went downstairs. I was on the rear terrace at 5:30, attending to the kitchen herbs Catherine had originally planted along the window boxes, a habit I had maintained for 3 years without examining it closely. I had a notebook open on the step beside me, old field notes from a courthouse project in 2019, which I had been reviewing to cross-reference a structural detail I needed. My reading glasses were balanced at the end of my nose, and I had paused momentarily trying to locate the correct page. Sloan came through the back door. She stopped when she saw me. Something crossed her face, a calculation quick and not entirely kind, and then she spoke. "Look at you." Her voice carried the particular lightness of someone delivering something they have been rehearsing. "The great architect. Is this what it comes to? You can't even find your place in a notebook." She leaned against the doorframe with her arms folded, watching me with the flat assessment of someone who has decided the person across from them no longer requires basic courtesy. "You can't remember how to hold a pen properly. You want to build a future for me with what exactly your mind is rubble, and I hate that I carry the name of someone as useless as you." The words were designed to land in a specific place. I knew the target, the part of a man with a deteriorating memory that already doubted itself at 3 a.m, that stood in dark hallways reading sticky notes in its own handwriting. A well-placed cruelty delivered at the right moment can do considerable structural damage to a foundation that is already compromised. I set the notebook down on the step beside me. I did not respond immediately. I looked out at the garden, at the placement of every plant Catherine had positioned by compass and notebook calibrated to the October light, designed to be at its fullest in the season she loved most. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Sloan directly. "You've played the role of an enemy very well," I said. My voice was entirely level. "But you've forgotten one thing." I held her eyes without looking away. "The weaker the foundation, the faster the collapse. So, tell me something. Sloan, do you believe you're avenging your mother, or are you watching yourself burn down your own life with both hands and calling it justice?" She did not move. The contempt that had been in her face 30 seconds earlier was gone. Not replaced by anything dramatic, but simply absent. The way a sound stops, and the silence that follows is louder than the noise was. Her arms unfolded from her chest. One hand found the doorframe beside her and held it. The arrogance had not retreated. It had simply discovered in the space of one sentence that it had walked into a room with no exit on the side it had expected. What replaced it was something raw, a tremor that started somewhere behind her eyes and worked its way down to her hands before she could stop it. She stood there for a long moment without speaking. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its rehearsed quality entirely. It arrived the way voices arrive when the performance has been abandoned, and what remains is simply the person underneath it, uncertain and unprotected. Did you know her?" she said. "My biological mother." It was not a question. It was the statement of someone who had already answered it for themselves and was waiting to see whether the person across from them would tell the truth or manage them. I looked at her, at the quality of attention in her eyes, which was Catherine's attention, exactly the same refusal to look away from the thing being looked at, the same capacity to read the answer in the pause before it was spoken. I pulled the second chair around to face her. "Sit down, Sloan," I said. "There are things you were told that were not true, and there is one thing you were never told that is." The portfolio from Vivian's office was still under her arm. She set it down on the step beside her without looking at it. She sat. For the first time in 21 years, she was about to hear the story of her mother from someone who was not Vivienne. And for the first time, she was ready to listen to it. Not because I had convinced her of anything, but because in the space between her cruelty and my stillness, something had shifted the way a latch releases without the door yet swinging open, responding not to force but to the specific patient application of the right kind of pressure. The October light was beginning to come long and amber across the garden. Somewhere in the tree line, a bird started its early evening insistence. The Blue Ridge above us went slowly from green to gold to the deep, honest purple of a mountain evening. I began to talk. September brought the first real cold down from the Blue Ridge, the kind that settles into Asheville valleys at night and refuses to leave by morning. Inside the hollows, Vivienne had been suggesting the widow's walk every evening for 4 days. The air will do you good, Edward. You've been inside all week. Each invitation carried beneath it the particular patience of a person who has decided on an outcome and is simply waiting for the conditions to cooperate. On the 5th evening, I gave her the conditions. I had prepared for this specific sequence for 11 months. The net high-tensile carbon fiber mesh stretched across the understair cavity had been load-tested twice using a weighted form, approximating my own body mass. The floor panel below the 3rd tread, counterweighted and hinged, operated by a cable release from the bunker, had been cycled 40 times to confirm it would open within the required window. Declan had rehearsed the retrieval in complete darkness until the movement required no conscious thought. I had practiced the fall itself over 3 sessions until the mechanics carried the specific quality of something unintended, because a fall that looks rehearsed raises questions I could not afford. She came to the base of the main staircase at 8:30, wearing the dark wool cardigan she favored in the evenings, and the ring on her right hand, a near-field haptic controller, capable of activating preset configurations through a specific rotation of the wrist. I had identified it 6 months earlier when Declan cross-referenced the LED array installed in the stair risers. The ring and the array were a paired system. She had been carrying the activation mechanism on her hand every evening for weeks. We began to climb. On the 3rd step, her wrist turned slightly. The change in the light was subtle enough that a person not watching for it would register it only as an atmospheric shift. What it actually represented was the activation of a directional LED array built into the tread risers, working with angled mirror panels concealed within the balustrade. The system introduced controlled discrepancies between what the eye reported and what the inner ear confirmed, the upper steps appearing lower and more distant than their actual position, the floor seeming to shift fractionally. For a man with a documented neurological condition, climbing that staircase in low light, the intended result was a fall consistent with his medical history. I let my weight shift forward on the 6th step. The arm came up the instinctive reach of a person losing balance, fingers finding the balustrade a half-second too late. I went over the railing the way a man goes over when his body has decided, before his mind has finished processing what is happening. The net caught me in under a second, silent and complete. The floor panel opened before the net had fully stilled. Declan's hands closed around both my forearms simultaneously. I cleared the panel. It sealed above me. Less than 5 seconds. Beginning to end. Above us through the boards came the sound of Vivienne's footsteps measured unhurried moving toward the entry hall. Then a number being dialed. Then her voice. "I need an ambulance. My husband, he fell. He went over the railing. I can't see him anywhere." In the bunker, Declan was already at the monitor. I came to stand beside him. Sloane was at the upper railing. She had come out of her room in the same window of time as the fall. On the monitor, her face was low resolution, but the body language required no clarification. She was gripping the railing with both hands, not the casual lean of someone curious about a noise, but the locked grip of someone whose body had responded before their mind had time to process it. She was looking at the place where I had gone over. Then she was looking at Vivienne. Vivienne stood in the entry hall below, phone pressed to her ear, free hand raised to her mouth in the gesture of a woman barely containing distress. The performance was technically precise, the right amount of breath between sentences, the tremor placed at the correct syllable, the voice breaking at exactly the moment a dispatcher would expect. It was the construction of someone who had rehearsed grief until it was indistinguishable from the experience of it. Sloane watched it without moving. I had seen her stillness before in the observation point across the garden steps at the kitchen table, but this was different. Not the controlled neutrality of someone managing their reactions in shared space. This was the stillness of someone who has seen two things simultaneously and understood in the same instant what their conjunction meant. On one side, a man going over a railing. On the other, a woman who did not move. Not a reflexive lean, not a half step forward, not even the involuntary shift of weight that protective instinct produces in most people before the conscious mind has engaged. Vivienne had stood on the fourth step and watched with the stillness of someone observing a scheduled event. Then she had walked to the entry hall and dialed with the unhurried precision of someone completing step 2 of a plan whose step 1 had just executed successfully. In the bunker, I thought about what was moving through Sloane at that moment. 2 days earlier, she had stood on the rear terrace and told me my mind was rubble. She had delivered the line with the fluency of someone who had been carrying it long enough that saying it felt like relief. She had believed at that moment that she was speaking a truth she had earned the right to deliver. Now she was standing at the upper railing of the same house watching the woman who had given her that line perform grief for a dispatcher. And the line was playing back to her in a context that made its origin visible for the first time. Not her words. Vivienne's words borrowed shaped-handed to a 14-year-old girl as a weapon, and aimed at a target the girl had never been permitted to know clearly. The phone call ended. Vivienne lowered the handset and stood alone in the entry hall, believing herself unobserved. The expression that crossed her face in that unwatched moment lasted no more than 3 seconds before the composed grief was reinstalled. But 3 seconds on a direct camera angle is enough. Sloane saw it. On the monitor, I watched Sloane's face. I could not read her from that distance, and that resolution the camera gave me posture, not interiority. What it gave me was this: both hands locked on the upper railing. No movement toward the stairs. No call downward. No gesture of any kind in Vivienne's direction. Just the body of a person who had seen two things at the same moment and had gone completely still while processing what their conjunction meant. Vivienne finished the call, lowered the handset, stood alone in the entry hall, believing herself unobserved. The expression that crossed her face in that unwatched 3 seconds before the composed grief was reinstalled was visible on the monitor. It was also visible from the upper railing. To anyone who happened to be standing there, Sloane was standing there. She did not move from the railing. She did not say anything. But her hands, when she finally released the rail, did not grip it again. She stood above the woman who had raised her and looked at her. And whatever she was looking at, it was not the same thing she had been looking at before the fall. The 3 days after the staircase were the quietest the Hollows had been in 16 months. Not the genuine quiet of a house at rest, the performed quiet of a theater between acts. When the stage is set and the lighting is prepared, and everyone who knows what is coming has already taken their position. Vivienne moved through those 3 days with the composure of a woman who had rehearsed her grief long before she needed it. She filed the missing persons report on the first morning, received 2 responding officers with the precise measure of distress the situation required, and answered their questions in the voice of someone barely holding herself together for the sake of being useful. It was an accomplished performance. I watched all of it on the monitor from the bunker and noted, as I had noted many times before, that the most dangerous quality Vivienne possessed was not her patience or her intelligence, but her absolute conviction that she was the only person in any room who understood what was actually happening. On the evening of the 3rd day, I corrected that assumption. At 9 o'clock precisely, the subwoofers began. The infrasound started below the threshold of conscious perception. 15 to 30 hertz building pressure in the room over 40 seconds before the first audible elements arrived. By the time the directional speakers introduced the sound of metal expanding under stress in the walls, the body was already primed. The nervous system was already interpreting the environment as dangerous. The mind was catching up to what the body had decided nearly a minute earlier. Then came the sounds of glass fracturing at a distance of masonry, separating along a joint of a structure, communicating with considerable authority that it was coming apart at its core. The lights went next, sequentially top floor to ground floor, each circuit dropping in the 4-second intervals. The house went dark in stages, the way a structure loses power when the main feed fails progressively rather than all at once. 20 seconds from first to last. By the end of it, the Hollows was running on emergency lighting, only the low amber strips along the corridor floors, leaving the primary rooms in deep shadow. Through the monitor in the bunker, I watched Vivienne come off the 2nd floor landing at a run. She came down the stairs the way people descend, when they are no longer thinking about the stairs, fast one hand on the rail, attention already in the room below. She was calling Sloane's name before she reached the bottom. Sloane met her in the center of the living room. For a moment, the two of them stood in the near dark with the sound of the house's simulated dissolution working on them from every direction. Then Sloane grabbed Vivian's arm. "What did you do?" Her voice cut through the ambient noise with the precision of someone who had been holding that question for exactly this moment. What did you do to him? What happened next was not something I had fully calculated. Because there are limits to what can be calculated about a person who has spent 16 months maintaining a structure of self-control and suddenly finds every external support removed simultaneously. Vivian's composure came apart, the way overstressed materials come apart, not gradually with warning signs, but completely. At the moment, the load finally exceeded every component's capacity at once. It came out in the order it had happened. The wax compound, the specific compound Sloane had synthesized in the attic laboratory, presented to her as a research formula. Applied to the floors of a house where a man walked barefoot every morning. The mechanism of dermal absorption. The timeline Vivian had mapped against the acceleration of Edward's symptoms. The false will, the bound portfolio bearing my name as testator, prepared without my knowledge. Designed to make Sloane the legal instrument of a transfer Sloane had never understood she was being positioned to execute. The Delaware LLC. The biometric device. Reynolds and his fabricated reports. The staircase 3 days ago. The ring, the LED array and the risers, the moment she had stood on the 4th step and watched and not reached out. Every element, every name, every amount. Sloane released Vivian's arm. She took one step back, then another. The distance she created was not the retreat of someone overwhelmed. It was the repositioning of someone establishing the geometry of a new relationship to the person across from her. When she spoke, her voice had lost every quality I had heard in it on the rear terrace 2 days earlier. The fluency was gone. The rehearsed delivery was gone. What remained was something that had not been handed to her by anyone. "You turned me into a monster," she said. "You put the words in my mouth and the compound in my hands, and you aimed me at my own father." And I said it. I stood in front of him, and I said it. A pause short, controlled the pause of someone who is not losing composure, but is choosing precisely where to place the next sentence. "You didn't use me to hurt him. You used me to make me hurt him myself, so that I would have to live with that." Vivian reached for her hand. Sloane pulled her arm away. The movement was not violent. It was final, the physical articulation of a decision that had already been made and did not require renegotiation. In the bunker, Declan and I watched the central monitor without speaking. The 11 cameras covered the same room, from 11 angles, the same 2 faces, the same space between them. The same air that now held everything Vivian had said inside it, like a structure that could not be demolished once built. Declan reached across and pressed the confirmation key on the encrypted drive interface. The timestamp locked. Every word, every name, every figure recorded, time-stamped. Admissible under North Carolina, one-party consent law going nowhere except into evidence. He looked at me. "That's enough," he said. "And that's enough," I said. Below the floors of my own house in a bunker, built on the bones of a wartime relay station. We sat with the recorded voice of a woman who had just confessed to everything she had spent 16 months concealing. Above us, the house held its new silence, not performed, not engineered, but the specific silence of a room in which the last false thing has finally been said out loud. I had timed the lights to come back on exactly 4 minutes after the final sound effect cut out. 4 minutes of complete darkness is a long time, long enough for the truth to settle into a room like something physical, dense, and immovable. I had designed the interval with that purpose in mind. Not punishment, architecture, give a space the time it needs to do what it was built to do. The living room came back into full light at 9:17. Not the warm amber of the house's evening setting, but the cool white of the overhead circuits, the working light. The light of a room being used for something that required clarity rather than atmosphere. I had switched the system from the bunker before coming upstairs, because I wanted the room to look exactly like what it was, a place where an accounting was taking place, and where the numbers were not going to change. I came in from the end of the hall. Vivian was standing in the center of the room where Sloane had left her. She looked at me the way a structural engineer looks at a load-bearing calculation that has just returned an impossible number. Not disbelief exactly, but the specific experience of a foundational assumption being removed all at once. The color left her face in 2 seconds. Her knees went in the third. She caught herself on the arm of the nearest chair and held it suspended between sitting and standing, her body receiving information that her mind had not finished processing. "You should be dead," she said, quietly. Not an accusation, a statement of variance between expected outcome and observed reality. "I'm aware of what you expected," I said. I set the USB drive on the coffee table and sat down in the chair across from it. A seated man is not a threatening man. A seated man is a man who has time. And I wanted her to understand I had a considerable amount remaining. She opened her mouth. The therapeutic voice began assembling itself, the register dropping the breath, calibrating the controlled distress she had deployed with precision for 20 years. She had used it on me at the Biltmore 18 months ago. She had used it on Catherine in 2006. She had been using it on Sloane since the girl was 14. The door to the basement stairwell opened. Declan stepped into the room. The therapeutic voice stopped. She looked at him then, at both of us together, and completed the calculation she had been unable to finish when she saw only me. Declan had been underground for 14 months, absent from every interaction she had witnessed, existing nowhere in her operational model of this house. He was Catherine's brother, a man she had considered safely archived in grief 3,000 miles away. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the patience of someone who has waited a very long time for a very specific moment. She understood then, completely. There was no version of the next conversation that worked for her, and she knew it the moment she saw his face. Sloane had been standing near the far window since the lights came on. Not beside me, not behind me. At the periphery of the room, arms at her sides positioned as far from the center as the dimensions permitted. Her head was angled downward, not looking at Vivienne, not looking at Declan, not looking at me. The shame in her posture had the specific quality of something that belongs entirely to the person carrying it, the weight of words already spoken that cannot be recalled, that live now in the memory of the man they were directed at. She had stood on the rear terrace 3 days ago and told me my mind was rubble. Now she stood in the far corner of her father's living room with her head down because she did not know what a person does with that. From the direction of the Blue Ridge Parkway, the first siren reached us. 31 minutes earlier, Declan had transmitted the evidence package from the bunker's secure terminal, 11 camera feeds. The full audio of Vivienne's confession, the toxicology documentation, the fraudulent estate documents, the written account I had prepared across 3 days. The officers were professional and unhurried. The handcuffs went on without incident. As they walked her toward the door, Vivienne turned once, not toward me, not toward Declan, not toward Sloane. She looked at the house. At its walls and ceilings and the long hallway leading back into the parts of the hollows she had never fully understood. Then the door closed behind her, and the patrol cars swept their lights across the tree line and were gone. The three of us remained in the room. Declan moved to the far wall and stood with his arms folded, the stance of a man who understands certain moments do not require his participation. I looked across the room at Sloane. She had not moved. If anything, the departure of the police had deepened the stillness in her posture. The external event that had been occupying the room was gone, and what remained was the two of us, the distance between us, and what had been said on a terrace 3 days ago. I crossed the room toward her. She took one step back, not away from me, exactly sideways, the instinctive movement of someone who does not believe they are entitled to the thing moving toward them. Her head stayed down. I could see the line of her jaw, the tension in her shoulders, the specific quality of someone holding themselves very still, because stillness feels like the least they can offer. I stopped where I was. I did not close the remaining distance, not because I did not want to, but because I understood that what she needed in this moment was not to be reached for. What she needed was to be waited for, the same patient wait of a person who has somewhere to be and is in no hurry to be anywhere else. I stood in the center of my living room and waited. Outside, the September fog pressed against the tall windows of the hollows. The house was standing, and so was I, and 3 feet away, in the corner of a room that was finally telling the truth about itself, so was she. The morning after the police left, I woke before sunrise, a habit formed over months of planning, when the hours before dawn were the only hours that belonged entirely to me. I came downstairs and found Sloane already on the front steps, still in yesterday's clothes, watching the sky above the Blue Ridge move from black to gray. to the particular pale gold of an October morning in Asheville. I sat down beside her without asking how she was. The fog was still heavy in the lower tree line, the kind that clung to the hollows between the ridges and burned off slowly as the light strengthened. The red and amber of the October canopy showed through it in layers, the near trees sharp, the middle distance soft, the far ridgeline barely present, as though the mountains were presenting themselves one at a time, unwilling to be taken in all at once. It was the kind of morning Catherine had loved most, the most honest light, she used to say, the kind that shows you exactly what is there and nothing more. I had been sitting beside Sloane for perhaps 10 minutes, preparing in my mind the first sentence about Catherine, how to begin a story that had been waiting 21 years for the right listener when she spoke first. I said your mind was rubble. Her voice was very quiet, not the flat contained voice she maintained in shared spaces, and not the rehearsed delivery she had used on the terrace 3 days ago. Something underneath both of those, the voice that remains when every constructed layer has been removed, and what is left is simply the person unprotected. I said you were useless, that I hated carrying your name. She stopped. The fog moved in the lower tree line, and the light came a fraction stronger through the canopy. I stood in front of you, and I said all of it, and I meant it when I said it, and that is the part I cannot. She stopped again, her hands, which had been resting on her knees, pressed flat against the stone step. I was so certain. She made me so certain. And I walked out there, and I used every word she gave me, and I aimed it directly at you. The tears, when they came without decision. Not the managed, careful tears of someone performing an emotion, but the kind that arrive before the body has finished consulting the mind about whether they are appropriate. She did not cover her face. She sat on the step and let them come, her shoulders dropping under a weight that had clearly been accumulating since the moment she had watched Vivienne dial a phone in an empty entry hall and understood what she was actually looking at. She opened her mouth once, closed it, and tried again. "I'm sorry," she said finally, and then again, because once was not enough. "I'm so sorry." The words came out uneven, stripped of every layer she had spent years constructing over them, and that was the only version of them that could have meant what they needed to mean. I placed my hand on her shoulder. She did not pull away. She went very still, in the way that people go still when they have been expecting something difficult and received instead something they did not know how to prepare for. A house sometimes needs to crack a little. I said, before you can see which part of the foundation was strongest all along, my daughter. She turned her face toward me, her eyes red at the edges and entirely unguarded, were Catherine's eyes the same quality of attention, the same refusal to look away from the thing being looked at. I had seen that quality across a kitchen table every morning for 8 years. I had not expected to find it here on these steps in this light. But Catherine had always had a way of appearing in the places you had not thought to look for her. I began to talk. I told her about a Saturday afternoon in 2011 when Catherine and I drove up the mountain road, and she said, without any drama whatsoever, "This is where we should grow old." I told her about the kitchen tile deep slate blue herringbone sketched on a paper napkin over dinner. I told her about the rear garden, designed by compass and notebook over 3 weekends, calibrated to the October light because Catherine wanted it at its fullest in her preferred season. Then I told her the rest. In 2006, Catherine had entered outpatient treatment for anxiety and depression, managing it quietly, the way she managed all difficult things without making a fuss. Vivienne was a newly qualified psychiatric nurse on the evening rotation. 24 years old, trained in the precise language of emotional vulnerability, and patient in the way that certain people are patient not as a virtue, but as a methodology. She spent 6 months getting close to Catherine. After that, things began to go wrong between us. Small suggestions accumulated over time. Catherine came to believe I had grown distant, that the work had displaced the marriage, that there was someone else. Nothing explicit. Just the weight of a story told carefully enough, over long enough, that it no longer felt like a story. Catherine left in 2007 because she genuinely believed the marriage had failed. She did not know anyone had engineered that belief. She carried it as her own conclusion for the rest of her life. She did not know she was pregnant when she left. By the time she knew, the separation had become something she had decided to carry alone, which was entirely consistent with every decision she ever made about difficulty. She did not ask for help with hard things. She managed them and moved forward. Vivienne found Sloane in 2017 when she was 14 years old in a group home in Columbus. She arrived with a story already built and ready to deliver: a father who had known and chosen not to claim her, a mother who had died without support, a wrong that required correction. She handed the story to a grieving 14-year-old girl, and she tended it carefully for 6 years, until it had become the foundation of everything Sloane understood about who she was and what she was owed. Every word of it had been constructed from nothing. Sloane sat without speaking for a long time after I finished. The fog had lifted from the near tree line. The October canopy was fully visible now, the red and amber that Catherine had designed an entire garden to complement, burning quietly in the early light above the house that had held all of this, in its walls and its floors and its hidden systems, for 2 years. After a while, without looking at me, she reached over and placed her hand over mine on the step between us. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Some things are communicated more completely through the specific weight of a hand placed deliberately in the right place than through any arrangement of words available to either person. We sat together and watched the Blue Ridge come fully into the morning light, one ridge at a time. In the week that followed the arrests, the Hollows finally exhaled. The toxic wax had been stripped from every floor surface by a remediation team doctor. Martinez recommended specialists in environmental neurotoxin removal, working from the compound analysis Declan had preserved in the bunker. The air felt different afterward, lighter. My feet no longer ached by evening. The numbness in my lower legs was retreating slowly but measurably, the way Dr. Martinez said it would, once the source had been removed. I was, in small but concrete ways, getting better. Declan knocked on the open door of the study at 4:30. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, the particular hesitation of someone reacquainting himself with rooms designed to be lived in rather than survived in. He came in and looked around with professional interest, taking in the drafting table, the scale models on the shelves, the architectural volumes arranged by the color of their spines. He stopped at the model of the Hollows and examined it without touching it. She told me once that this house looked like it knew it was being watched, he said. She mentioned that to me, too, I said. Different words, same observation. He turned from the model. She was right about the house. She was also right about you. I set down my pencil. She was right about most things. We talked for the better part of an hour, not about legal proceedings or contingency plans or what came next in any practical sense. We talked about Catherine, the specific person she had been, the way she made decisions, the particular quality of her attention when she was thinking through something she had not yet resolved. Declan knew the younger sister, the girl who had grown up as the steadier one, who had learned early that carrying things quietly was what kept other people upright. I knew the woman at 40, at 45, the garden designed by compass and notebook. The way she had said this is where we should grow old without any drama whatsoever. Between us, across that hour, we assembled something closer to the whole of her than either of us had been holding alone. When the light through the west window had gone from amber to the deeper gold of late afternoon, I opened the bottom drawer of the drafting table and held out an envelope. "This isn't a will," I said. "Open it when you're ready." Inside, a formal employment contract offering Declan Shaw the position of Director of Security for the Hollows and its associated properties, permanent tenure, full benefits. A private apartment to be constructed in the East Wing. A compensation rate reflecting both the market value of his expertise and the 14 months he had spent exercising it without pay or recognition. "I can't protect Sloane indefinitely," I said. "Not with what's happening to my memory. Not alone. You know this house better than anyone alive. I need that knowledge to stay here with her. After I'm no longer able to provide it myself." He looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he took it. I turned back to the drafting table. The yellow sticky notes had come down that morning. All of them, the rows of handwritten reminders that had covered the hallway walls for 2 years. The index cards of a man mapping his own mind before it could rearrange itself without his permission. I had taken them down carefully, folded them, placed them in a document box that now sat on the lower shelf. Not discarded, archived. They were part of the history of this house, and I did not believe in erasing history. But they did not need to be on the walls any longer. In their place along the corridor outside the study door, I had pinned the new drawings. Architectural plans, clean lines, honest dimensions, a room designed from the foundation up, with a single purpose to be exactly what it appeared to be. A room at the top of the house, the highest point of the Hollows, where the Blue Ridge was visible in 3 directions on a clear day. Generous proportions, large windows facing east and west. No mirrors, no concealed panels, no speaker arrays or camera housings, or any of the infrastructure I had spent 2 years embedding in the bones of the building. Just walls light, and the honest geometry of a space built for someone who deserved to live somewhere that had nothing to hide. I had labeled it in the corner the way I labeled all my drawings, one line for Sloane. Behind me, the door to the study opened quietly. Her footsteps were soft on the hardwood she had inherited, that from Catherine the particular quality of moving through a space without announcing herself. She came to stand beside me at the drafting table and looked at the drawing. Then she looked at the corridor at the new plans covering the walls where the yellow notes had been. She stood there for a long moment reading the lines the way someone reads something they did not know they had been waiting to see. Then she looked at me. "Does Dad?" One word, not a question, not a statement. But the thing that exists precisely between the two, the word of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally found the right place to set it down. Not the word she had used 3 days ago when she called me useless. Not the word she had withheld for 21 years out of a grief that had been handed to her pre-assembled by someone else. This one was entirely her own. I set my pencil on the table. My hands in that moment were entirely still. November came to Asheville with the particular cold that arrives when the Blue Ridge has finally decided summer is finished, not gradually, but with the overnight finality of a structure settling into its permanent position. The dogwoods along the front drive had gone bare. The rear garden, which Catherine had designed to be at its fullest in October, was holding its last color against the gray morning light, the deep amber of the persimmon she had planted along the south wall, the rust red of the ornamental grasses she had chosen, specifically because they looked best when everything around them was retreating. She had understood better than most people that the most honest beauty is the kind that stays after everything decorative has fallen away. Inside the hollows, the house had arranged itself into something I had not designed for, and had not fully anticipated a life that resembled with increasing accuracy the thing a house is actually built to contain. Vivian Calloway occupied the ground floor. The court had granted house arrest pending trial on one specific condition: she was to remain within the walls she had tried to steal. My attorney had done more than confirm the arrangement raised no legal issues. He had written it into the house arrest order itself, submitted to and approved by the presiding judge as a specific condition of Vivian's confinement at the Hollows. She had chosen the house because she believed she was choosing the more comfortable option. She had not fully calculated what comfort meant in a building she no longer controlled, in a house that remembered everything. Every morning at 7, the ground floor speaker system began its cycle, not the simulated sounds of structural collapse I had used in September. Something quieter and considerably more permanent. A single audio file 43 minutes long, playing at a volume just sufficient to fill a room without constituting harassment under any measurable legal standard. A threshold my attorney had confirmed, and the court had accepted. Her own voice, the full recording from the night of the confession, every name, every amount, every action described in the present tense of someone who had just watched 16 months of self-control dissolve in a darkened room. The wax compound, the biometric fraud, the forged will, the staircase and the ring on her right hand, and the 3 seconds she had stood on the 4th step and watched without reaching. I had not designed this as punishment precisely. I had designed it as context. A person awaiting trial for the crimes she committed should not be permitted to spend the intervening months reconstructing a self-narrative in which those crimes did not occur. The recording prevented that. Every morning before she had her coffee, Vivian Calloway was reminded in her own voice of exactly what she had done and in exactly what order she had done it. The court had agreed that this was appropriate. The court had in fact signed it. I was on the 2nd floor balcony when she came into the front sitting room on the 4th morning. She had not known initially that I spent the early hours there. She discovered it on the 3rd day and had not looked up since, which told me with considerable precision exactly how she was processing her current situation. A woman who does not look up at the person watching her is a woman who has decided that acknowledgement would cost her something she is not prepared to spend. She had spent 16 months calculating costs and benefits with the precision of a structural engineer. She was still doing it. The difference was that the structure had already failed, and she was the only one in the building who had not yet fully accepted the assessment. On the 4th morning, she looked up. I was reading. Coffee on the rail beside me, the Blue Ridge moving from its early gray into the clear pale blue of a November morning, cold enough for a jacket, not yet the deep cold of December. I looked down at her over the edge of the newspaper. Our eyes met for approximately 3 seconds. I did not say anything. I did not need to. The architecture of the moment said everything that required saying a man, in his own house, on his own balcony in reasonable health, reading the morning paper. A man who was supposed to be dead. A man whose continued existence was the most complete refutation available of every calculation she had built her plan upon. There is no courtroom argument, no legal maneuver, no reframing of evidence that accomplishes what a living person accomplishes simply by being present and coherent in the morning light. She looked away first. I went back to the newspaper. Behind me, through the open study door, I could hear the quiet sounds of the house operating, as it was supposed to operate. Declan's footsteps on the east wing landing measured unhurried. The systematic movement of someone who had spent 14 months living in 43 square feet and now had the full run of a floor and a half. He completed his morning security review with the same discipline he had applied in the bunker. Every camera feed checked, every access point logged, every parameter of the monitoring system that kept the ground floor contained and the upper floors free. He had moved into the East Wing apartment 2 weeks earlier. He had not cashed the first paycheck. I had noted this without comment. He would. Eventually, when the idea of being compensated for being exactly where he needed to be had become something he could accept without it feeling like a transaction. Some things take longer than others to settle into their permanent position. I had learned over 60 years of designing structures not to rush the settling. Sloane came up the interior stairs at 8:15, with 2 cups of coffee, one for me, one for herself, and took the second chair on the balcony with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years rather than weeks. She was enrolled again at UNC Asheville. Her biochemistry program resumed with the full support of a department chair who had received through proper channels a detailed account of the circumstances that had interrupted her studies. Her academic record, it turned out, was exceptional. The work she had done in the attic laboratory, whatever its intended application, had been the work of someone who genuinely understood the material at a level most undergraduates did not reach until their final year. She was going to be extraordinary. Catherine had known that I thought, had trusted without evidence and without guarantee that the child would find her way to something that deserved her. She had. Through the worst possible route via the longest detour a person can take through their own life, she had found her way to this balcony, this chair, this cup of coffee in the November light. She sat beside me and looked at the mountains the way Catherine used to look at them, as though they were doing something worth watching slowly, if you were patient enough to wait for it. We sat together and did not speak for a long time. Below us, Vivian's voice continued its morning recitation through the ground floor speakers, the 43-minute, accounting of everything she had done and everything she had believed she would get away with. It was not an unkind sentence. It was an accurate one. And accuracy, in my experience, is the closest thing to justice that the physical world reliably produces. That evening, the study light stayed on past midnight. Sloane had fallen asleep in the reading chair by 10, a biochemistry text open on her lap, her breathing slow and even. I covered her with the blanket Catherine had kept folded on that chair for the better part of 20 years, the wool one gray-green from a shop in Weaverville she had loved. Her hand found mine in her sleep. I did not move. I sat at the drafting table with her hand in mine and worked until the Blue Ridge outside had gone from black to the first pale suggestion of gray, which is the color it turns in the hour before it decides to become a mountain again. The house was quiet around us, not the performed quiet of a place holding its breath, the genuine quiet of a structure that has been asked to bear a great deal and has borne it standing now, the way good buildings stand without drama, without requiring acknowledgement, doing exactly what it was designed to do. I am Edward Calloway, 47 buildings. The last one built to cage a monster, and I chose to stay and hold the key. The house is still standing, and so am I. I designed 47 buildings in my life. None of them taught me what this family story did, that the most dangerous structure a person can live inside is one built from lies dressed as love, and maintained through manipulation so patient it feels like care. Family betrayal does not arrive with noise. It arrives with perfect coffee, a well-timed smile, and a hand that knows exactly where to find you when you are weak. I know because I lived it. An architect with early-stage Alzheimer's, A house I built with my own hands, and a woman who believed I was already gone before I had finished planning my response. Don't be like me. Don't wait for a diagnosis or a locked door before you ask who is truly standing beside you. Trust is not a one-time decision. It is something you read daily. In the small details, people cannot fake forever. I am not a religious man, but the morning my daughter's hand rested in mine, a daughter I nearly never found, I understood why people say thank God. Not because I survived, because I lived long enough to give her the truth she had waited 21 years to hear. My personal view, the most devastating family betrayal, is never the dramatic kind. It is quiet, consistent, and wearing your favorite person's face. This is my family story. I hope yours is lighter. If this story of trust survival and family betrayal moved something in you, leave a word below. Share it if someone you know needs to hear it, and if you want more family story told, honestly. Without shortcuts, stay. This channel will be here. Thank you for reading to the very last line. Ahead, some stories contain fictional elements for educational purposes. If that is not for you, right now, step away, find what fits, and return when ready. No pressure. But if you stay, we tell it all the way through.